All summer, we heard the calls to defund the police. And Portland did, by $15 million. Now, 2 city commissioners are saying, what's another $18 million? And this year, Election Day isn't just an event, it's a deadline. But when can we expect to actually know the results of this election? Now just 1 week from today. And a viewer wants to know, what exactly does it mean when your ballot is received? I mean, are you good to go? Are they still verifying your signature? Is there anything else I need to worry about? Because I would really love to just be able to vote and move on with my life and not be anxious about whether or not my vote counts. I mean, that wasn't her exact question, but you get my point. Here's the story. Thank you for being with us. I'm Dan Haggerty. Welcome to The Story. We got some people watching our inbox and our social feeds for your comments and questions. I'm going to read a few at the end of the show, so email me at thestory@kgw.com. Find me on Facebook or Instagram, or use Twitter and that hashtag #HeyDan. Now, I know the last week or so we've been really election heavy on this show. By the way, I should mention Election Day is 1 week from today, so get those ballots in. But before we get into all that, I want to talk about the police. Now, it's been a while since the protests and the riots and police accountability and all that has kind of dominated the conversation, and those calls to defund the police have quieted a bit, I would say, at least in the streets. But those calls are loud and clear once again, this time from inside City Hall. And that brings us to our big story. 2 Portland commissioners want to slash another $18 million from the police budget. And I'm sure you remember at the peak of the protests this summer, the city already chopped the budget by $15 million, and that was a historic amount of money at the time. Now, Maggie Vespa found out what these proposed cuts could cost the Bureau and what our mayoral candidates think about it. I'll give you a hint. One likes it, one doesn't.
Amid months of nightly protests and a historic spike in shootings and violent crimes,
it's kind of scary.
2 city commissioners are pushing to slash millions of dollars from the Portland Police Bureau's budget again.
Over and over and over again, we've seen outrageous behavior by police.
Commissioners Joanne Hardesty and Chloe U. Daly, both vocal critics of police, were not available for interviews Tuesday. Staff say they're preparing for Wednesday's city council meeting, where they're slated to weigh fall adjustments to this year's budget. As part of that, the commissioners have promised to push for major cuts to the Portland Police Bureau, more than $18 million total. If this sounds familiar to you, you're not having deja vu. Back in June, the city council voted to cut $15 million from PPB. The move came amid historic anti-police protests following the death of George Floyd. But it fell far short of local protesters' demands to slash $50 million. At the time, Commissioner Hardesty pushed back on that number.
I want to be clear that $50 million number was based on nothing. There was no analysis done.
This time around, Hardesty is only formally proposing the new total of $18 million in cuts. In a recent memo, though, to fellow commissioners, she suggests the city can get there by specifically eliminating a list of personnel and teams within the Bureau. Among them, 42 positions vacated by officers who retired in August. Instead of filling them, Hardesty wants the city to get rid of them. That, she said, would save around $7 million. She also wants PPB to eliminate a combined $1.2 million in funding for the Special Emergency Response Team, or CERT, and the Rapid Response Team. The latter is a key component of the Bureau's response to protests, which have continued almost nightly for months. Hardesty writing in that memo, I believe there is a different way forward from where we have been. A Portland where a reduced police force is focused solely on solving crime, where crime is addressed through a public health lens, and where we make reinvestments in community and police alternatives. In this case, she calls for the money to be reinvested into housing and COVID relief, especially for Portlanders of color. It's worth noting Commissioner Hardesty has repeatedly demanded Mayor and Police Commissioner Ted Wheeler hand her control of the police bureau, a demand he has repeatedly refused. At a press conference Monday, he also refused to endorse her cuts.
We still have a number of questions about virtually all of them in terms of, number one, what would be the impact on public safety if the reduction was taken? And number two, how did they get the numbers that are on that list of proposals? And I'm not sure that all of those are necessarily accurate.
His opponent in next week's election, Sarah Iannarone, enthusiastically endorses the cuts, especially if it means pulling police back from protests.
Just in June, $4 million in police overtime. We're going to be millions of dollars over budget in terms of police staffing this year through a lack of bad management, frankly, and an inability to deal with the protests in the streets.
Commissioners will have some time to weigh their options. A final vote on the supplemental fall budget won't take place until next week.
Okay, Maggie Vespa joining us now. Let's do a little bit of math. You know, protesters initially demanded to have $50 million cut from the Bureau, which sounded like just this massive, impossible number, really. Instead, council approved a $15 million cut. If they've moved forward with this $18 million cut, we'll be looking at a combined $33 million cut from the Portland Police Bureau, which still sounds like such a huge number. Can you put that into context? How substantial is that?
I can. And by the way, Dan, good math. The Portland Police Bureau's budget was supposed to clock in this year prior to any of these cuts at $244 million. So if you were to take $33 million from that total this year, you'd be looking at a more than 13% cut to the Police Bureau's budget. So that would be historic. But again, it's not that $50 million that protesters have called for.
One thing that has people concerned as we discuss cuts has been the rise in crime that has seemed to be in conjunction with the $15 million cuts that we saw during the first round. They got rid of the gun violence reduction team, and we have seen a rise in gun violence. What are people to think as we still are in this spike in crime and we're talking about more cuts potentially down the line?
Sure. So it's worth noting that there is debate around the cause of that spike in violence. The mayor's office, for instance, points out that this is happening in other major cities across the country. And they also point out that spike in gun violence was actually happening prior to the last round of cuts, prior to that $15 million in cuts. At the same time, the Portland Police Association, the union that represents police officers, says absolutely not. They do blame this spike in violence on those cuts. They say there's no question. We do want to point out, by the way, we reached out to them as well as the Police Bureau, and they didn't want to comment on this story.
Got it. You know, as we talk about policing and some of the cuts that can be made, the conversation always turns to the alternatives, right? How are we going to fill that void? And the street response team kind of came out of that conversation early on during those first round of cuts, and it got the green light and the go-ahead, but I haven't really heard much about it since. So where do we stand with the street response team now?
Sure. And so for reference, by the way, for viewers at home, the Street Response Team, remember, is that program where teams of crisis counselors and EMTs would respond to calls involving mental health and drug addiction, things like that, instead of police. That was supposed to launch this year. Long story short, the pandemic delayed those plans. So those have been postponed to early next year. That said, hiring is reportedly underway. So there is some progress on that front.
All right. Interesting. Maggie, thank you. Now, I want to remind everyone something. You might have forgotten about this, but some Portland police officers are still federally deputized until the end of the year. And now we are actually seeing the first federal charges come out of that. Now, just to kind of refresh your memory on this topic, last month, ahead of some expected right and left-wing clashes, about 50 Portland police officers and Multnomah County Sheriff's deputies were deputized as federal marshals. And what that means is that they were given the power to arrest people on federal charges, which they normally can't do. Now, after those protests, Mayor Wheeler asked the feds to then undeputize them, but they said, no, sorry, it's actually going to stay that way through the rest of 2020. That, again, was a month ago. And we haven't seen any real federal indictments come out of those deputizations until now. An 18-year-old from Hillsborough named Skylar Ryder was just charged with assaulting a federally deputized Portland police officer. Court documents say it happened at the protest near the ICE building earlier this month. Now, this could mean more prison time if he gets convicted. If that police officer was not deputized and Ryder was arrested on state charges, he could face up to 5 years in prison. But since he's being charged in federal court, he could get up to 8 years behind bars. All right, let's turn to politics now, and a question from Brandon Bishop in Southeast Portland. What is the latest presidential race poll in Oregon and Washington? I think it's a great way to kind of kick off tonight's election coverage. Now, the West Coast kind of gets forgotten, I think, during the presidential elections, so we often don't really hear about the polling out here, usually because we tend to be a sure thing for Democrats. But that's also going to be the case this time, according to the polling website 538. 38. Biden leads comfortably in both states. In Oregon, as you see in the numbers there, as of today, Biden is up 57 to 37%. And in Washington, Biden is slightly leading, even slightly stronger there. He leads 58.8 to 35.5%. And Oregon and Washington are way ahead of the rest of the country in one regard, and that's early voting. I mean, we kind of are used to Election Day being a deadline rather than an event here where you get in line and you wait to vote and all that stuff. But because of COVID-19, nationwide, more people are taking advantage of early voting by mail, which means it might actually take longer to count ballots on Election Day and decide a winner. Now, we talked about this with Dr. Chris Shortell. He's a poli-sci professor at PSU, and he explained to us why we may not be able to declare a winner by Election Day despite so much early voting.
One piece of it is there's just more votes to count. There's going to be a lot more ballots that election officials are going to have to tabulate in order to come up with a number that's going to be useful or meaningful. Another piece of that, of course, is with the pandemic, the increase in the number of mail-in votes. Now, in Oregon, in Washington, people are used to voting by mail, and the infrastructure is in place to handle that volume of voting by mail. But in many other states, that's not the norm. And so the usual number of absentee ballots that they might receive is expected to increase tremendously.
There'll be some long nights for some states. So with that in mind, we found a resource that we think is worth your time, and it's on the New York Times website. Analysts broke down when they expect every single state to report their final vote totals. And just to give you some, an idea of a starting point here, we talk about Washington and Oregon being so far ahead of everybody else. For Washington, they say officials expect less than half of all votes will be reported on election night. So it's going to take time there. And in Oregon, officials didn't even have an estimate, really, on when they think the unofficial results will be available. But they do say in the last two presidential elections, for a comparison, there were still about 10% of the ballots left to count by noon the day after Election Day. We're going to share a link for you on the story's social media pages. If you're interested, hop on there and check it out because, again, we think it's worth your time. When the story continues, if a political campaign has money left over, where does it go after the election? And this Halloween, you won't just find clowns at the circus.
Sadly, we are also reporting 3 deaths today.
Apparently, you'll find them at the Oregon Health Authority, too. Welcome back to the story. Thanks to everyone leaving us messages using that hashtag HeyDan or sending us emails at thestory@kgw.com. I want to quickly pass along that today is the last day that voters in Oregon can safely mail their ballots through the post office. So if you didn't get it in the mail today, you should plan to drop it off, your ballot, in one of those official Dropbox locations. We answer all kind of election questions on kgw.com and right here on the show. Again, keep using that hashtag HeyDan. We're actually going to answer some right now. Emma emailed us and said, my ballot online says received. Does this mean my signature has been verified? So we checked with Tim Scott from Multnomah County Elections on this one. He said that your ballot getting officially accepted means that the signature has been verified and is waiting to be opened and counted. And by the way, Tim also says that Multnomah County started opening ballots and scanning them into the tally system today. And while we won't begin to hear about the results until, after 8 o'clock on Election Day, we do have an update for you on overall voter turnout. Looking into the Portland metro counties, all 3 together have turned in more than 500,000 ballots so far. Headed south to Marion County, voters have turned in more than 93,000 ballots, giving Oregon statewide more than 1.3 million votes, exactly 1 week now out from the Election Day deadline. Headed north, checking on Clark County, more than 144,000 ballots have been turned in. Statewide, a whopping 2.2 million ballots. Nice job, Washington. Oregon has a lot of registered voters because becoming registered is as simple as getting your license. But it wasn't always this way. So how did we get here? Before 2016, registering to vote in Oregon was a 2-step process. First, you had to get your state license or ID. Then, and only then, could you register to vote at the DMV. But in 2015, Governor Kate Brown signed into law House Bill 2177, which made it so when you get your license or state ID in Oregon, you automatically were registered to vote. In other words, instead of opting in to register, you literally had to opt out. It was the first law of its kind in the United States. Since 2016, many states have jumped on the motor voter bandwagon, and not just because of the catchy rhyming name, because it's effective. In the 2012 presidential election, Oregon had a registration rate of 75%. But in 2016, after motor voter, that jumped to more than 87%. It's only expected to get higher this year. And that's how we got here.
Okay, Pat Dorr is joining us now. So, Pat, ever since motor voter went into effect, we have more people registered to vote in Oregon. That makes me feel like it's working, but are more people voting?
Well, it's a good question because part of the argument for people who didn't like this idea is that if you weren't motivated enough to register yourself to vote, would you really vote anyway just because you went to the DMV? But yes, more people are voting. In fact, so many more that the campaigns, the Republicans, the Democrats, the major parties are taking note of that, and they're starting to target those unaffiliated voters, which they argue brings in a lot more diversity and is good for everybody.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because if every single new person that moves to a state, into a city like Portland that is exploding in population and has been for the past 10 years, you're going to get a lot of diversity, people from other states, other parts of the country, other parts of the world in some cases. And here they are registered to vote now. Is that changing the way that candidates run or what their platforms are, things like that? Have we noticed that type of difference yet?
Well, yes, there is at least a slight difference. For example, there's a House district race going on in Hood River County, and the number of unaffiliated voters is about 16,000. The number of registered Democrats, also 16,000, and the number of registered Republicans is 14,000. So that both campaigns are going after those unaffiliated voters. So those are people that got registered, but they didn't care enough to send in a card that said, yeah, I want to be a Democrat, a Republican, a Libertarian, any party. It's basically, yeah, I'm a voter. Come convince me why I should go with you. And so the parties are having to do that to try and get their vote. And so far, that's a very tight race, I'm told, in Hood River County, and the unaffiliated voters may just decide who the winner is.
One thing that I've been thinking about, you have to be 18 to vote. How old do you have to be to drive legally? Is it 16 here in Oregon? So when
I think 15 and a half, you might even be able to get a permit.
15 and a half, right? You get a permit. So when you go and you get your driver's license and you're only 16, do they register you to vote then?
Yeah, they do. You cannot vote until you're 18, but it kind of queues you up in the system. So if you're like in the middle of the presidential 4-year cycle, when you're 16, by the time it's time to vote for president, you're 18 and you're already in the system.
Interesting. All right, Pat Doris, Thanks for the details, sir.
You bet.
Now, it's no surprise you've been getting a lot of mailers, right, in your mailbox about certain measures or candidates, or seeing ads nonstop. I know a lot of people have been writing us in about that. And it's not cheap if you're a candidate. None of that stuff is. It all costs a pretty penny. But with less than a week to go now until the election, a viewer named Sally wanted to know this. Where does all the leftover money go after the election? That's a great question, Sally. I've thought about that in the past. And according to the Oregon Secretary of State's office, candidates cannot use that money for personal purposes, which I'm sure you assume. They can, however, donate it to another candidate if they want. They could donate it to a charity if they want to do that, or they can just leave it in their campaign fund if they plan on running again down the line. All right, you know what time it is. Grab your phone, send us a message, use that hashtag HeyDan, send us an email to the story at kgw.com. We're going to read a few right after the break. And how about the Oregon Health Authority? They learned a lesson today. Never send a clown to do a doctor's job. We're going to finish the story next. I can't believe it's almost Halloween and the month's almost over. It's flown by, but every time around this time of year we start to get people that ask me or Laura or Matt if anybody on KGW plans to be dressing up for a show on Halloween. And the answer is no. We won't do that. I mean, I know we're boring. We're stuck-up journalists. I get it. But I promise that we have a good reason. As you can tell, we like to have fun on this show, but you can run into some issues, and we also don't want to look like the Oregon Health Authority did.
Hello. I'm Dr. Claire Pochet. I'm a general pediatrician and also a senior health advisor here at the Oregon Health Authority. And we thought we'd start by giving you a quick update on where we are as a state with COVID-19. As of today, there have been 38,160 cases of COVID-19 in Oregon. Sadly, we are also reporting 3 deaths today, bringing the statewide total for COVID-19 related deaths to 608.
Man, all right. The whole point of that was Halloween safety tips, but that's usually how they open those things up. And I get it, Oregon Health Authority, you're not used to doing this. You're on TV a lot now. You've been doing fantastic work. That's not what this is about. But take some advice from the TV folks who are used to being in front of the camera. We're going to be talking about life and death. Leave the clown paint at home. Word of advice from the story. Take it if you want it. All right, hey, let's talk about some comments here. So this one is coming in from Patricia. She said, hey, Dan, it's important to note that only citizens are automatically registered to vote in Oregon. Too many people believe that non-citizens are being registered. That's a good point. I don't want to bring that into the conversation, but for anybody at home, that is true. Just because you are getting a state-issued ID, if you are not legally here in this country, you don't get automatically registered to vote in this country. They have safeguards for that. We have another one. So the question is, if a person votes and then passes away before Election Day, does their ballot count? The answer is yes. In fact, I did a story with the elections office in Multnomah County not long ago, and they said that a lot of people use voting as one of their final acts, which is kind of poetic, I think. But yes, it does count. And then lastly, somebody said, hey, Dan, Kristen often uses a screen to convey the news. You know, Kristen Severance does the touch screen when she's talking about things and she'll swipe. And he asked, is there somebody in the back who just changes the screen when she swipes her hand? No, it's a touch screen, just like an iPad. We got fancy stuff here, KGW, man. This is the real deal. We're not messing around. That's the story. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks for being with us.